So every time I talk to a social justice warrior or a feminist or somebody that's claiming systematic oppression, one thing continually comes up, and that is the claim that their experiences are evidence of systematic oppression. There's a huge flaw in their argument, and I'd like to lay it out for you. First, let's start with the experience to begin with. Experience is a good thing, technically. Experience is what you build when you learn a trade or learn a function. Anything that's around functional knowledge often uses experience to back that up. For example, you learn a trade, and it doesn't matter what trade it is. It could be any trade. It could be flipping hamburgers. The person that's been doing it longer will be more proficient and better at that task than the person that just started. And that's because their experience in learning that profession or learning that task supersedes the one that just started. So what happens when you take a claim that experience is aligned or works well with a claim to reality? Well, let's first start with work experience, because that's a claim to reality. Everybody has to work, right? Well, in work experience, you do learn things as you're going along. The culture within the organization, the way they handle business, the way you can meld or blend in with that culture. It's completely different for every organization. It depends on where you go, but each organization has a culture that you blend into. That type of experience is something you learn on the job. Now, the experience that you bring with you when you take on the job is the reason why you got it in the first place. If you go for anything that's beyond something that's menial high school work, beyond working at McDonald's or Burger King or where have you, you require both experience and knowledge before you start that position. The reason why an employer will look for knowledge-based workers that have the experience to go on with it is that they don't have to train that person or wait for that person to apply the knowledge in a real-world situation. Just because you learned it in a textbook doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to apply it in the real world. So when you apply, say, a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering with working in a petrochemical industry, what you have is a degree that will get your foot through the door and maybe no experience behind it. Maybe you're just out of college. If you took an internship during your time at college, which is an entry-level position, then you would have the experience to back up the knowledge that you're about to place within the organization. Now, if you've been on the job for 20 plus years and you're working within the same company, which is a rarity these days, but let's go along with it, and you have a master's degree back that up, the experiences that you collect are everything that you've left behind. All your innovations, all your new tasks, your new work, all the things that you've done within that organization all pile up to the experience of that job. This type of experience is extremely valuable because it becomes implicit knowledge. It becomes something that's intrinsic to the organization, and unfortunately, you're the only one that carries it. That kind of functional knowledge, where it can be transferred to another person easily, is something that experience becomes of value for people. But what about the personal experience? If we move away from the job, the work experience, the things that are task-oriented, then what you have is the personal experience of reality. The Mormons, for example, will have a personal experience that they like to tout about Jesus or God or something of that nature, and that is their evidence for the existence of either. Their personal experience therefore becomes the evidence. No two people have the same experiences. You may grow up in the same neighborhood, but you may have different family structures. You may have different neighbors. You may have different friends in high school. You may have different friends growing up. You may have a family that tried to stay together, and you may have a family that split up when you were 3 months old. All these situations are very drastically different, and even your physiology will not match the other person. Those type of experiences are personal experiences. They are your perceptions of reality. Unfortunately, when you come into the realm of biases, people like to conflate their experiences without negating the possibility for their own bias. So let me give you an example. I grew up in Utah, and in Utah, it's 97% white. So it is very easy for that kind of society to have a very skewed view on anybody that's not white because of their population. However, I know of very few people out of Utah that are not racist. If they're Mormon, I can almost bet and almost ensure that they are racist. If you really want to know why, look up Nephi 5:21. It pretty much says that God cursed the skin of everybody that wasn't pure of heart or pure of the first tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel, and he cursed their skin, meaning they made them darker. And the worse off you were, the darker you were, the more cursed you were. So the blacker you are, the more cursed you are by God. It's a pretty fucked up religion, and that's in there. They've tried to explain it away, of course, but it was written in the 18th century when people still owned slaves. So I'm not surprised at all that the founder was a complete racist asshole. If you grow up in a situation like that and come out not racist, what's the difference? What happened to your situation that changed the paradigm? What happened there? Well, in my experience, and this is relying on my experience, mind you, so these are my biases. This is something that I have observed, that if you watch the behavior of the individual, treating somebody that looks different poorly, mainly because they look different, you either will accept it because you're part of the in-group, i.e. a Mormon, or you reject it because you're already outside the group. Like me, I was raised atheist. But that personal experience is a perception. So I could claim, by all intents and purposes, not being racist in the situation where I don't consider those with darker skin than mine to be cursed by God. I don't believe in a God, so cursing is out of the question. But here's the problem. The personal bias that I contain and the personal bias everybody else contains can warp that experience. If you were indoctrinated to believe, just as all the Mormons were, that anybody of darker skin is cursed by God, you've outgrouped a class, a complete group, based on skin because you were trained or you were raised to believe such. And here comes the problem I have with claiming systematic oppression. The argument I had not too long ago was regarding the resume test. It's all intents and purposes was a pretty good test. However, their hypothesis was flawed, and it was flawed so tremendously that it made the entire test worthless. What do I mean by that? They were not testing a system. They were testing personal biases. They were testing racial biases. So instead of testing racial biases, they could have tested the system. It really comes down to the form of their hypothesis. They claim that there was systematic oppression exists, and it exists within hiring practices. So the way they tested that was sending out blanket resumes, two of the same kind, looked exactly the same. The only thing different was the names on the resumes. You would see two candidates with the same experience, the same educational background, and it would be Tyrone versus Chris, basically. Or Shaniqua versus Emily. If you want a guy or girl, it doesn't matter to me. There wasn't a gender test as far as I saw, but there could have been one, and it probably would have ended up about the same. What they were testing with that test was the racial biases of hiring managers. They were not testing the system itself. Allow me to explain. So when you go through a hiring situation, what you end up doing is you have to go through a process to pick out the best candidate possible on the employer's side. So if you get a bunch of resumes and everyone looks exactly the same experience, same background, same education, the only difference is name, they're going to look at this and go, which one is better for the situation, which one's better for the job, which one's going to fit better in this culture. Now, all they've tested in this point is the hiring manager going and looking at these resumes and say, yeah, Tyrone ain't going to fit in this organization, but Chris, he probably would be. That seems like a pretty good name. That is a racial bias of the hiring manager. So the test itself tested the biases of hiring managers. It did not test the system. You were testing people that worked within a system, but you did not test the system itself. So in order to test the system, you would have to test the things that take place for hiring managers to see if there's any racial biases in those tests. So they're looking at the wrong thing, essentially. So to claim systematic oppression in hiring, for example, which is one of the more compelling tests that they've done for the racial bias tests, if you're looking at hiring and you're just testing the racial bias of hiring, you're not testing a systematic oppression of people. You're finding out that a bunch of hiring managers are racially biased. Not necessarily racist, but they are displaying their own biases through their actions. Does not mean that they think the other person's not as good. Just means they for some reason felt like Tyrone wouldn't fit into the culture, but Chris sure would, for whatever reason. Usually that is a racial bias position. If all things created equal, all things are exactly the same across the board, they have to make a decision. There's one job, not two. They can't hire both. So what do? Lean on their biases. In my blog, and I'll link it in the description, I list out a bunch of different tools that hiring managers have used to try and scrub any personal information, all demographic information out of it, including age, which actually is almost impossible, because if they have experience on top of education, then you can tell who's been in the workforce longer, so it kind of doesn't work that way. What they can do is they'll take a set of resumes, they'll take out all personal information, all the email addresses, the names, anything that's identifiable, and they'll put a number in there instead, like resume 602, 603, so on and so forth. And then they'll codify those in a quantitative method in order to determine who would most likely fit based on experience and knowledge, and maybe the skill set that person advertised. Who would fit best into the position or the job? Once they scrub through all that, they usually end up with just one or maybe two people, and at that point the hiring manager has to look at, well, this one has more of the skills that I'm looking for and this one doesn't. Or if you were to set a set of resumes into the same system, the same way they were trying to prove that there were racial or the systematic oppression of hiring managers through the resume blanket study, what you'd end up with is no one would get chosen. They would choose somebody else based on their qualifications. They would choose somebody else based on the determining factors, however they scaled the needs of the company, as it were. The names would never appear in that system because they would be scrubbed out of the resumes upon arrival. No one would be able to see them. The HR person that gets the email would be able to see them, but that's not the person making the decision on who gets a job or not. So again, they didn't test the system, they tested racial biases. Now here's the problem with claiming systematic oppression, and you take this type of evidence along with whatever perceptions you have and claim there is systematic oppression. You are doing nothing more than displaying your own personal biases. You are displaying your perception of what you think the system is doing to you. Not necessarily what is happening, but what you think is happening. There's very few people that don't have a racial bias. It's extremely difficult to not have a racial bias, but what has to happen for that not to exist is either A, you have to be a part of a mixed relations couple, meaning that it's black and white, or in my case, I'm married to Filipino, so there's that. And then you also have to teach your kids that skin doesn't matter. And you have to drill that from day one because it is implicit bias. It's something that you were indoctrinated into believing. So if you're indoctrinated into believing that white people are the devil, and all you hear your family talk about is how they've been screwed over by a white man again, and every time they bring up a conversation, they mentioned the person's race every single time, you're going to drill into a child's head to pay attention to race more than they should. There is a undertone of unconscious bias. You can call it the first level consciousness. This is your animal instincts to know that person that looks like you is probably safe, person that does not look like you is probably not safe. So you would automatically tribalize yourself just by grouping with other individuals. So when you're talking about social phenomenons and claiming that your experience and the lived experiences of black folk or white folk or whatever you want to call it is the perception of reality of what is, that there is a white genocide, that there is systematic oppression, what you're really doing is putting your own biases on display. You're not actually making a sound argument. You're not actually putting forth anything that's real. Your experiences, and the ones that you claim exist for everybody, are actually your own perceptions of what you think everybody else is experiencing. They're not actually anybody else's but your own. The biggest problem with the claim of biases and the use of it so far, implicit, unconscious, and so on, is that the implicit and unconscious biases are not capable of being racist. They are ingrained, they are taught. Intrinsic biases, the implicit biases, those can become racist once you've developed to a point where you will be able to reason. If you're able to reason, your implicit bias equals these people are bad, I am good. Or if you're able to reason that your own skin or your own race is bad and other ones have been oppressed and therefore they must be lifted, these are all racial overtones. In fact, the thing that I hate the most when people start out a conversation is when you say something like, as a white man, I believe that there is no systematic oppression. What's wrong with that statement? As a white man. The moment I say that, I negate any other person's experience, I negate any other person's perception, I negate every other person's race, and claim that my experience is better than theirs. By doing so, I claim that I am better than you. My experience is superior and yours is therefore inferior because it is my experience, and mine is more important. It is an individualized perception coupled with a group persona, because it's as a black man claiming that all black people have the same experience. This is not true in the long run. You got to look at people that have multi-million dollars, people that don't. There's not a whole lot of rich people out there. There's a whole lot of poor people. So to claim that as a black person or as a white person you have a certain lived experience, and that somehow translates into the reality of a systematic oppression, is a falsehood. You're displaying and projecting your own biases on the situation. Thank you all. See you in the next one.
Enough. Don't ever try to flatter me or you'll be sorry. I don't like it.